Before I get into it, I just wanted to highlight this resource that's available. It's called transportecology.info. It's an open access website. I encourage you to have a look at it. Top right corner, there's a little blue box called subscribe. So chuck your email address in there. We'll spam you every second day. Once a month or so with updates. What the website includes is summaries that you can give to your mum and dad, and they should understand the peer-reviewed research. So it's peer-reviewed articles, we're summarising them in a blog style. There's also case studies and best practice notes, all about pretty much what I'm going to be talking about today. Most of the focus today that I'll be presenting will be about roads, but it's also related to railways, to power line easements, to pipelines, and waterways and canals, and ski runs, walking trails, and fences. So the impacts are similar, the kinds of impacts are similar, it's just the severity of those impacts and the scale, the spatial scale at which those impacts extend away from the linear infrastructure. We've got about 64 million kilometres of roads on the planet at the moment. That's enough to get to the moon and back about 83 times. And we've got about 7 million kilometres of railways. If anyone was taking notice of Gary's talk, the numbers are slightly different because we don't really have excellent ways yet of, or databases of different types of roads around the world. Nevertheless, someone else used the word this morning, so I think I can get away with it. There's a shitload of roads and there's heaps more coming. That's, I guess, if there's one message you take away from today, if you think there's a lot now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Infrastructure planning and construction is the way we are going to get out of this COVID recession. We've been doing this for the last 20 years. Every time there's some sort of crisis, we're going to build stuff and it's going to bring us out of whatever problem we're in. By 2050, there's another 25 million lane kilometres of roads coming. Just pointing out, it's not 25 million kilometres, it's lane kilometres. There's a slight difference. 90% of that infrastructure will be in developing countries. The number of cars on the roads are going to triple across the world. There's going to be 5 times as many cars in developing countries. 70% of the infrastructure, this one blows my mind every time I say it, 70% of the infrastructure that will be here in 2050 is not yet built. That's not just roads, it's all sorts of infrastructure. And one of the major sort of global drivers is the Belt and Road Initiative, from which China's leading. We think there's about $1 trillion worth of money going into roads, railways, ports, hydro dams, etc., right across the world. There's obviously a whole bunch of impacts which we are concerned about. Perhaps the most obvious one is nothing. Good. No, go back, sorry. I think I'm getting a bit too excited here. Can we go back a couple of slides, please? One forward. Stop, right there, stop, go, okay. Good, thank you. The first one is habitat loss. Okay, clearly when you want to build a road or some sort of infrastructure, you need to clear the existing vegetation. Then there's also wildlife vehicle collision and mortality. I think Gary had a number of 1 billion animals killed annually across the world. It's astronomical. We're worried about some other kinds of impacts on wildlife. Well, perhaps the elephant in the room, if you like, is mortality from collisions with cars and trains. And then there's barrier effects. The bottom picture there is actually a festival in a holy site in India. So it's not a busy road, but it's wall-to-wall buses. The barrier effect only gets worse as the number of cars on the road, the number of lanes on the road, the speed of vehicles on the road increases. The barrier effects get worse. There's other things. There's avoidance. There's all sorts of other impacts that's happening. What's important to understand, though, is that the impacts don't just happen next to the road itself. They actually extend. A recent study, 18 kilometres for Western chimpanzees in Africa. You could measure the effect of the road for up to 18 kilometres on each side of the road. So the next time you might be looking at a road proposal, an impact assessment, and they've just looked at a 100 metre wide corridor, tell them to go back and tell them to look at this thing called the road effect zone. The road effect zone, the size of it varies depending on the species involved, the traffic volume, the topography. So for example, if you're in a flat area, the road effect zone is going to be larger than if you're in the mountains. If you're downstream, it's going to be bigger than if you're upstream. And of course, it's also related to the size of the road and the traffic volume. So much so, estimates suggest that in the US, about 1% of the US has roads on it, but about 20% of, this is continental US, about 20% of the US has been impacted by roads. So it's a massive impact. So that's the bad news. The good news is what I'm going to show you now is basically the ways in which we can effectively, oh, I got a fright there. Looks like I had 8 seconds left. Just so, this is what it looks like. Oh, wait. It's like, ah. Anyway, the ways that we can avoid, minimise and mitigate those impacts, we've been doing this now for probably about 30 years. We know pretty much what works and what doesn't. Keep in mind, though, that many of the things that I show you will be about minimising mortality and restoring connectivity. The things I show you does not mean that you can put a road anywhere or a railway, put up a couple of crossing structures for animals and then wipe your hands and say the job's done, because that's not how it works. There's still a whole bunch of impacts that go beyond just restoring connectivity and reducing mortality. This first example, though, is the most impressive. It's a 700-metre long land bridge. It goes across a canal, so it's in the Netherlands, a canal, a major highway and a railway. It's for wildlife and it's for people. Best thing to do, avoid, avoid, avoid. This proposal has come up again and again for the past 20 or 30 years. It's about building a highway across the Serengeti. Someone mentioned 100,000 wildebeest this morning. The solution to maintaining connectivity for 100,000 wildebeest that was proposed was a couple of culverts under this road. So for starters, I don't know how the wildebeest knew it was there. For seconds, I'm not sure, did they take a number and a ticket and then take it in turns to orderly cross? There's 100,000 stampeding wildebeest. Culverts are not going to cut it. So my point there, avoid, avoid, avoid in the first place. Then you don't need to do anything else about what I'm talking about. Crossing structures for wildlife, we know how to build these for many, many different species. There's still a few groups that we're not sure about. So some of the microbats, birds in Australia, certainly in Southeast Australia, amphibians. They're some of the groups that we're still kind of coming to terms with what's the best design. Nevertheless, your top right corner, you've got bridges larger than they need to be so that wildlife can go underneath. You've got top left is an underpass there for tree kangaroos. I don't think that one's worked. We've got stock culverts with other structures and furniture, we call it. These are for arboreal animals, for possums, and we've got land bridges, that examples from Compton Road, not far from here. And in terms of how do we know these things work? So there's lots and lots and lots of monitoring projects that go out, put cameras or whatever technique, lots of different species using them. And so we can say without any doubt, lots of species use these structures. In Banff National Park, it's been a combination of research and applied research and mitigation, 17 years of really detailed efforts. They've demonstrated gene flow, they've demonstrated increased population viability, a whole range of really important parameters that go just beyond do animals use them. The Dutch, obviously slightly different spatial scale and focus of management compared to Australia, but they've just spent about 440 million euros over a 15-odd year period to defragment the existing road, rail and canal network. The cool thing about it was the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Infrastructure were the same ministry. They weren't separate, they were in the same building and they were talking together and they got this done. Identified 178 bottlenecks across the country, installed 550 different things. Some of them are underpasses, some are overpasses, some are fencing, and they solved the problems at many of these locations. They've now got more than 80 of these land bridges across the country. This is the longest underpass, wildlife underpass. It's about 1 kilometre in length. It's between two elephant and tiger reserves in India. It's now completed, and there's been at least half a dozen different tigers using this underpass. As I said, millions of photos now around the world of a whole range of different species. The top one, your top left, is mountain pygmy possum. We've got kangaroos. You know, there's lots of ungulates from North America, Europe and Asia. Probably many of you have seen these glider poles. Sometimes people think they're just power poles and someone forgot to put the power lines up. These are actually for gliders to get from one side to the other. We've got now hundreds of these, plus hundreds of canopy bridges. We kind of started this in Australia. It's now being adopted around the world. Lots of evidence for use. We've got brush-tailed phascogales, gliders, families of ring-tailed possums, and one goanna, which was cool. The cockies love them too. We've got underpasses in Africa for elephants. This is in Kenya. Pretty much the day it opened, the wildlife were using it. Coincidentally, I just got to tell you this little story. We put up a canopy bridge a couple of weeks ago. On the Tuesday, we put cameras up on the Wednesday. The Wednesday night, there were possums going across the bridge. It doesn't necessarily take months for animals to find them and use them. You can use existing structures and modify them slightly. This is on Christmas Island. Just put up some of these little bits of metal sheeting. Someone forgot to tell that little crab hanging off the side. That's to funnel them into the underpass. Badger pipes, real cheap and simple. Hundreds of these now across the UK and Europe, and happy badgers using them. Keep the footprint small. So rather than have this massive wide clearing, keep it small. Okay, it'll take you a little bit longer to build. It might be a little more expensive, but you keep the canopy connected and the animals will use it. Existing culverts, you can put ledges and shelves on the side of those. Koalas will readily use those structures under existing bridges and culverts. Fencing is really important. We need the fencing to keep the animals off the road. There is no other way to stop animals getting killed on the road but to use fencing. You can't do fencing alone because that increases the barrier effect. So we need to do it fencing and crossing structures together. We've done a review of international published papers, about a 95% success rate in reducing mortality if you've got fencing and the crossing structures working together. I think the future will be these multi-use structures where we've got people on one side, but the bulk of the space is there for wildlife. This one has just been finished, so the vegetation on that wildlife side will grow and will become used by wildlife. There's a whole bunch of these other sort of things that we tend to do. So the go-to has been put up signs. Signs don't work, particularly this one. After I was 400 kilometres past this sign, I forgot I had to keep an eye out for wildlife. In fact, stray animals, kangaroos, yep, not sure about that one. But anyway, there's also other technology that you can put on the side of the road and put to the front of your car. The evidence for those, the studies have either been fairly poorly designed and highly criticised. There's also not much evidence that any of these techniques actually work. I was having a conversation with a council person and I said, look, I don't know how well these things work. The evidence is not great. You know, why are you putting them in? And he said, well, there's no other choice. On this particular road, it's full of driveways and intersections and things like that. I can't put up a fence to keep the kangaroos off the road. And if this reduces mortality by 5% or even 10%, then it's a success. That's a good point. Thank you very much.